All right, we are here with Dr. Fields, who is our resident language expert when it comes to everything IB Latin. She needs no introduction at WPS. She has graciously volunteered to answer some kind of difficult questions from the knowledge framework when it comes to thinking about um, how language impacts our knowledge that we have. So my first question for you, Dr. Fields, is, and we actually did a debate on this in class just today, is it possible to think or know without language?
Yeah, I think that's a hard a hard one. Um we th- I think what makes this question difficult is that we have language, so we think in our language. And most of us think in a combination of language and images. And some people don't think with images at all, though. They only think with language. And so it's hard to imagine how we would formulate thoughts without language. But at the same time, if you think about like infants, they might not be thinking at the level we're thinking at, but they're certainly thinking, and they are processing their world pre-language, and then as they hear language, they are learning to associate the things that they think and know with the words that they're hearing. And so I think, having watched that happen with my own child, I think we must be able to think before we can use language. We just then lack a capacity to share that knowledge. And so the follow-up question to that is sort of what good is knowledge that you cannot share? And so language is the way that we do that. Um, but I think yeah, thought must and people who are mute and deaf still think. So I think thought does exist without language.
Okay, that's interesting that you said that point about an infant, because that was one of the things that came up in our debate today. They said that, a baby can still feel the sensation of hunger, right? And they can still, to some degree, communicate that, even if it doesn't sort of involve a language other than just sort of, making a sound, which is crying. Um,
Mhm.
then I said, well, what if we changed the knowledge question slightly and we thought about like levels of thought? And
Right.
they kind of thought that they agreed that it is possible to do some degree of thinking without language, but if we're really going to get to the kinds of thinking that are valuable to do not only in a DP subject or in TOK, that we have to use uh, language with a defined set of rules.
I would think so. Um, there's I had to study a lot of cognition when I was writing my dissertation, and one of the things that I learned a lot about is how our brains have like a kind of like unconscious system of thought, which like they actually just call system one, so that's really convenient. Where we're like mostly living in the world of emotions and responses, and then system two, which is our like logical active cognition that we have access to. And so I think, like an infant is operating almost entirely in like system one until they're able to move into logic and thinking as they take in language.
Okay. So could you say then that we don't necessarily need language to think and know at level one, but it's a requirement for level two?
I would, yeah, I think it probably is. And I suspect that if you isolated an individual from, access to language, that as they matured and developed, mental pathways and things like that, that they would develop some form of personal language that they were using within their own brain, to order and systematize whatever they're experiencing.
Okay. Okay. So this is I picked this question out on purpose, knowing that you are a Latin teacher. And
Okay.
there are certainly are stereotypes out there about, or maybe some agreed upon sentiments about Latin as a language. If a language dies, does knowledge die with it?
Yeah, I think that it does. And Latin obviously like is something we talk about as a dead language, but in the strictest sense, like it still exists. So even if it's like kind of stalled, we still have full access to the language itself. But we have still lost so much from Latin and Greek, because the language did not stay active. And then where it was staying active, it was so limited. So like we've lost unknown amounts of like philosophy and science and religion texts and like engineering, like all sorts of things. There are works that we know exist that we don't have anymore. And a lot of that is just the chance of history and the fact that like as people stopped reading this language and speaking these languages, Greek and Latin, um, people stopped reading that literature, and so it stopped being copied. And we just lost so much. And who knows what information we could have if we had those texts. Like we don't have a single thing Socrates himself said. We only have what like Plato says he thought. And we don't have so much of the scientific work that came out of Alexandria because the libraries there burned. And so we've lost all that, but we do still have a lot because small groups did keep these languages alive. But if you think about like the loss of a lot of languages now that are dying off, like there's a lot of Native American languages that we're losing, and a lot of those are oral only languages, and entire traditions and bodies of knowledge are just going to be completely gone when those languages disappear.
Right. Okay. Yeah, cool. After we finish this call up, I'm hoping I can get you to send me an article on something along those lines if you have one.
Okay.
It seems like maybe Latin isn't dead. Like maybe the phrase "a dead language" is a little bit misleading. Maybe at worst, it seems like Latin is almost like a zombie because
Yeah.
it seems like it has a huge impact um, on the structure of a lot of languages that are very commonly spoken today. Would you say
Yeah.
that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And like in some ways, Latin is still alive. It just evolved into the modern Romance languages. And same thing with ancient Greek, like evolved into modern Greek. And for the most part, like if you take if I were to suddenly like be dropped down into the middle of Italy right now and I tried to say something in Latin to an Italian person, they'd pretty much understand most of what I was saying. They would just think I was like speaking weird. But they would get a lot of it because so much of the language is still embedded in those modern languages. And then, the Vatican, it's still the official working language of the Vatican. And so there are people living within that church community that are speaking it, not just like reading it, but speaking it from childhood. And they're people whose job it is to help create new words for modern things. So, the language continues on, but it doesn't have a natural native speaking community. And so, yeah, in some ways it is like a bit of a zombie. Like we keep it alive, without having a real like host, a real language speaking population. But the way like your knowledge question was phrased sounds like we're talking about a language like dying and disappearing, being completely gone.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we could, at least relevant to Latin, we could change this knowledge question maybe a little bit to say, if a language evolves, does knowledge evolve with it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I like that.
Okay. So last question, last one. You've done great so far. Uh,
Thanks.
if language works according to sets of rules and conventions, how much scope do we have as individuals to break or challenge these conventions?
Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of you have to know the rules to break the rules. So I think, this even just takes me back to like, poetry composition classes in college and stuff. Like you can't become E. E. Cummings until you know all of the rules that you're breaking. So like as we learn a language, we internalize its internal grammar and structure, like without having to be directly taught, this is what past tense is and this is what a subject is. Like we learn all of that and we form a mental representation of the grammar. And that's important because those rules allow what we say or write to be understood by people who share that language with us. And if we break those rules too much, then we run the risk of being misunderstood. And it's our job as communicators. The burden of being understandable is on the person communicating. It's not on the person who's interpreting to try to figure out what we meant to say. So I think if you know the rules, then you can learn how to break them in ways that push the language and push thought, but still leave your meaning comprehensible to your audience.
Okay. So it seems like if the answer to this question was no, we don't have any degree of scope, um, then we wouldn't have things like local dialects and slang
Right.
and things like that.
And language would never change.
Right. And it seems like to
Really
some
boring.
degree that that those things there's an element of culture there.
Mhm.
Right? Like people, on the East Coast of the United States, they're gonna have a different set of slang than on the West Coast, right?
Absolutely.
So um, So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times you see people breaking rules, right? Rules sort of exist, like you said, for efficiency, right? And that's
Mhm.
probably pretty important if we're trying to communicate, right? But they can also be kind of limiting,
Mhm.
right? So it seems like maybe to some degree, language is an art,
Absolutely.
or between an art and a science.
Yeah. And I would say the linguistic side of language, that's the sciencey part. And then the active use part is more the art part. And then linguistics will later on seek as the artists develop new modes of expression through language, the linguists will find a way to explain that phenomenon later on. Um, and so I would say with things like slang, as slang develops within a community, the who understands that is constantly growing. And as long as understanding happens, that slang eventually becomes part of the language. There are plenty of things in our language that were slang in the past. And now, I mean, I don't even know how many times a day I say okay. And that was originally a newspaper slang. And so those things become part of the language over time and become part of the rules.
Right. Okay, cool. Those are my knowledge questions for you. You are off the hot seat, Dr. Fields. Thank you. No, this was really helpful. I'm sure that the students who watch this one will get a new perspective on how language sort of helps determine what knowledge look like. So, thank you.
You're welcome.